So the second sub-theme for the third theme, which is society and transition, is basically a very specific one. It's basically women, or changing role of women during the century. So the extent to which basically life changed for those women, and you can also get questions about the main reasons for those are. So before I go into it, this question, the way we're going to divide it is as follows. I'm going to do a summary because I think it makes sense to do it this way. I'm going to do a summary first of all, or go over. I'm going to split it up into two parts. First of all, I'm going to do political and economic change or advancement as a topic together, because those kind of fit as a topic. And then we're going to look at more social changes, or the way we're kind of phrasing it is sort of family life and personal freedoms as another one. So I'm going to go through, this is why it's going to seem a bit confusing, 1918 to 79, looking at political and economic advancement, and then we're going to go through 18 to 79, purely looking at family life and social advancement. Oddly enough, this kind of caught out a lot of people in last year's AS exam, and it really annoyed me because I warned them several times. It's one of those topics which people naturally seem to know more about in the post-war period and perhaps find more interesting. I think there's actually more to talk about in the interwar period. It's more interesting, hence why it came up that way last year. I also think interwar is a more easy topic, because if you do post-war, it includes stuff about new wave feminism, which I think can be ideologically a little bit tricky, or sorry, conceptually a little bit tricky for some people. And I think measuring and gauging its impact is actually not easy, whereas other things, like some of the topics we'll look at in a second, for the interwar period, it's really easy to gauge impact. And that's what I've noticed as a trend in this course. A lot of topics are very difficult to elaborate on in an essay question when it comes to the question of what mechanism do I have for gauging impact? Because and that's when people then often have to rely upon a statistic, which can obviously sometimes be difficult to remember. Anyway, so I'm going to go first of all the political and economic changes that take place. Let me just drop that blind. So, brief summary of the period comes to the political and economic changes. So, obviously, going back to 1918, as always, it shouldn't be a surprise that women are excluded from a range of opportunities that are open to men. The kind of the big context of that year in terms of what's going on is, and we're not going to look at it in detail at all, but obviously you should be aware of the fact that prior to 1918, that's really when female suffrage campaigners, or the suffrage campaign, is kind of in full flow. And so suffrage campaigns have been hoping since the beginning of the century, or trying to get the vote. And there was also hope that actually gaining the vote would therefore be, or lead to further reform in other areas. However, gaining the vote, as you'll see at the beginning of this period, did not necessarily lead to very significant or immediate reform throughout the century, and there were limits to that. Additionally, again, as you'll see, the political voice, again, despite getting the vote, was not as strong as they would hoped. And economic advancement, again, was also quite slow to come by, and arguably quite limited as well. So, first thing we're going to focus on is political advancement. This is I think this is the easiest part of this topic. And again, when people mentioned this topic last year, I can't believe some people did not even talk about the vote. It's the most simple point to make, and it's really easy to measure. So women have been campaigning for the right to vote, or the franchise, as you can call it technically, since the 19th century. Okay, and right at the start of this period, it's the very first thing that comes about. 1918, the government passed the Representation of the People Act. It has a range of provisions, but for this topic, our most important one is it gives the right to vote to women over the age of 30 who own property. Okay, so therefore, as a result, only educated and respectable women were given the franchise. The idea being, initially, that women who are too young would be a bit too emotional or responsible to be given the vote. And so despite that opposition to giving young women the vote, 10 years later, further act is passed, and the franchise is then extended to all women over the age of 21. And so, after further suffrage campaigning took place, and so by 1928, men and women basically have equal voting rights. They've been given the same voting rights that men have. So all men of the age of 21 can now vote. So, does voting lead to political advancement? So in and of itself, if a question comes up, you can use the idea of the Representation of the People Act as a argument that women advanced. Gaining the vote is something. However, what you can then do straight afterwards, which you should do, is then explain how there are clearly limits to that advancement. So the right to vote does not lead to more general political advancement as a result. After women gained the vote in 1918, or gained the franchise, only one woman gets elected to Parliament, right? And that number itself does not change significantly over the interwar period. In fact, the numbers remain quite low in the interwar period. The highest number which it reaches is in 1931, it reaches 15, and that's because that would have been when there was a Labour government. Labour governments of the time tend to have slightly more female MPs, but then after 1931, the figure once again drops off quite a bit. So it peaks at 15 and actually drops off again after that. So the numbers normally remain very small for the entire period. Now, of course, you could argue that, well, that's because it's Westminster. Westminster is very difficult to get to. Oh, right, sorry, when I say get to, not physically, as in it's a difficult ceiling to break through. Becoming an MP is not easy. Surely, on a wider level, there's more representation. And it's only really marginally so. So women were only slightly more influential at a local level, so local councils. They only form about 15% of all local councillors. It's a large number, it's still a very small one though. And so what's quite clear is that women failed to achieve significant political advances, or rather, you could say, to project a significant political voice, despite forming a majority of the electorate. So that advancement is limited. The reason for those limits are the structures of and attitudes of main political parties at the time. The structures of those parties tend to act as a barrier for political advancement. Main parties are often unwilling to select female candidates in safe seats because they're scared of losing them. When we say safe seats, for those who don't do politics, there are certain seats that political party will never really lose. So, for example, if you take a seat like, I don't know, like a seat, for example, in the industrial heartlands of the north, that will always be a Labour seat no matter what. Yet, despite them being safe seats, political parties are a bit worried of giving a safe seat to a woman in case she actually loses it, because by virtue of being a woman. So as a result, women would be selected to contest seats at election time, but they'd be given really difficult seats. So again, if you were, let's say, so if we say that industrial seat in the north is a Labour seat, the Conservatives might let a woman run in that seat. She's not going to win, and she'll be given difficult seats to win. They won't give them easy seats. And so as a result, it becomes difficult for women to actually enter Parliament in the first place. The second reason is they still kind of consider a woman's role to basically be at home. And so they kind of do allow female participation within politics, but it tends to be within the political parties, but it tends to be the really basic kind of like grunt work. So it's canvassing, leafleting, the really simple roles. Their role within a political party is not seen to be to become an MP and get a significant position within the party. And so the party's attitudes themselves remain quite sexist, you could say. And that acts as a barrier towards advancement. So that's their political role in the interwar period. Looking at their employment opportunities, the situation again isn't much better. In fact, it's arguably worse. Coming out of the First World War, so the First World War basically leads to a large increase in female employment. So the reason being, obviously, the men go off to fight in the war. So as a result, women take their roles in the factories. And so metals and chemical industries alone see workers increase from 200,000 in 1914 to 1 million in 1918. So 1 million women working in these industries. However, those gains that are made in employment in the following decade are almost entirely overturned. Okay, when the men come back from the war, women are basically expected, or rather their work was only really expected for the duration of the war. When the men return, they're expected to return back to whatever they were doing. They're forced out of the workplace by those men who return back from the front. And so female employment levels actually returned to their pre-war levels in the interwar period as a result. So there's actually very little advancement or gains made in terms of employment opportunities, as gender roles, or traditional ideas about gender roles, remain quite dominant. It is not considered for a woman to be working in a factory, so they won't. So in terms of gender roles, what you do then find as a result, again, there's clear-cut continuity. Women are basically expected to continue in the kinds of jobs and roles they might have been involved in before. This basically is what they would call in-service work. And so in-service work is basically jobs such as being a maid, a cook, a cleaner, etc. That is the traditional role of woman. So if a woman was going to go into employment, those remain the largest methods or routes for employment for a woman. Okay, it's unpopular. Women did not like it. It was difficult work, but prejudice obviously was a reason behind why that was the case. That was seen to be a woman's role, and therefore more suitable for her to be participating in. Additionally, education. Again, this is where there is a link between this topic and sub-theme 2C, which is the education topic. If you guys recall, we talked about when it came to education in the interwar period, when it came to university education, women rarely got the opportunity to attend university. The numbers remained, I think we said 25% of women were in university, or I think it was 25% of students were women in universities. And so it was very difficult to actually attend university. So as a result, women lack educational opportunities, and as a result, they lack work opportunities that come from those same educational routes, you say. And so women were kind of stuck with kind of old traditional jobs, and it's very difficult for them to kind of escape those. However, there is some variation in class. Okay, and this is again an area in which it links into perhaps the class discussion. When we looked at class, working class women are restricted to in-service work. If you like, the worst thing to be in the interwar period in terms of opportunities is a working class woman. You pretty much have no opportunity outside of maid work or whatever. Sometimes they could be involved in light manufacturing work, but it's really poorly paid and it's quite rare as well. So if you're a working class woman, you've pretty much got no opportunities. More educated women, so a small minority of women who are more middle class and actually were able to get into education, as a result, they could advance a little bit more and take on more clerical roles. So yeah, when we say clerical, roles like secretaries, etc. If they had some level of education or had managed to kind of go to sort of further education afterwards. And so clerical roles substantially grow after the war. And so there's a gradual improvement in the situation for middle class women as some universities gradually begin to accept them. So if you're a middle class woman, you can escape this trap. If you manage to get an education, there are some roles you can take up. But it remains limited to those women. So that sums up the interwar period in terms of political and economic advancement. The post-war period sees very little advancement for women. Okay, so there are examples of women who basically are able to progress and do quite well for themselves, but in many ways those women are the exceptions that prove the rule. Okay, so if we're an example of political advancement, the number of female MPs, much like it was in the interwar period, stays consistently low. It's normally between 20 and 30 MPs. That's not a substantial gain from what it was in the interwar period. And it's because that same prejudice continues against women within political parties. People believe that for a woman, she's too busy doing domestic duties, she shouldn't really be an MP. Interestingly, that same point applies to certain Mrs. Thatcher. So if we actually look at the examples if we look at the exceptions to the rule, so not only do women rarely get to become MPs in the first place, as I said, it's between 20 and 30. If you manage to become an MP, advancing beyond that also remains quite difficult. So if you want to, for example, join the cabinet or the shadow cabinet, it was, again, extremely rare. So they rarely received cabinet posts after winning seats. And so actually, in this entire period, there are rarely more than 1 or 2 women at any one time sitting as cabinet MPs. I mean, the only examples I can think of off the top of my head, without looking at a list, are obviously Mrs. Thatcher here behind us, and Barbara Castle. Barbara Castle, of course, name should ring a bell, because of the In Place of Strife document. Off the top of my head, I can only think of those two. Like there's a few others swirling around, but I can't pin them down. But what's interesting is, even if you look at Margaret Thatcher, who's obviously the most high-profile example of a female MP in this period, of course, in our period into the Prime Minister, she is herself the victim of party prejudices when she first tries to get a seat. So that same point we talked about in the interwar period, how women would never get selected for safe seats or realistic seats. When she first gets selected to run for election, I think she runs for a couple of seats and she fails both times because she gets given really difficult seats. And she struggles to be given a seat which she can run for that she actually has a realistic chance of winning, despite often being a superior candidate to many of her male rivals. And so on 2 occasions, she gets placed in a safe Labour seat to run there, which obviously she was never going to win, before finally being given a more realistic seat. I think in the end it's Finchley or somewhere. So it's only at the 3rd attempt that Thatcher gets given a seat that she can realistically win. She loses twice because of the seat she was given. So that's in terms of the political situation. I think for this post-war period, you can definitely argue that very little political advancement takes place, and actually it stagnates. Yeah, okay, she becomes Prime Minister by the end of it. You could swing it that way, and she becomes party leader in 1975. That is within our time period, so you could use that point. But I think the overwhelming point is actually her success is the exception that proves the rule. Economic advancement, world economics, the economic situation. There are some advances in terms of the economic situation or employment opportunities of women after the Second World War. So prior to 1944, there is something in place called the marriage bar. What this basically meant was that most women were required to give up work once they were married. So if you were in any kind of profession, once you got married, the idea was you were meant to basically give it up and just be a housewife and do domestic roles. From 1946 onwards, major employers gradually begin to get rid of the marriage bar. So in 1944, the marriage bar is removed from teaching. In 1946, it's removed from the civil service. The Bank of England removes it in 1949. So these are all public employers for the time being. And so most other employers follow suit of the 50s and 60s. It starts off in the public sector, then even the private sector gradually begins to remove the marriage bar. And women, as a result, are able, increasingly, to continue to work after marriage. Having said that, although the barrier is no longer there, a large number of women themselves are quite ambivalent towards work and actually prefer to leave after they're married anyway, as they weren't that keen on it in the first place. The option was there to stay, but a lot of them decided either way they didn't want to. Would rather settle down instead of married life. Okay, the second major battleground though, so on the one hand you have this issue of the marriage bar. Can women actually take roles? The next really major battleground, which is one that will be very familiar because it's probably not, because there's still ways to go currently. After women are able to remain in work, the major obstacle becomes that of pay. So it was pretty much normal for women to get paid, or for employers to pay women less than the men on average. So the average tends to be 40%. So you get paid 40% as an average than a male worker for the same job. Again, on this same issue, progress begins to be made over the period. So in 1958, again, it's often the public sector which leads the way first, and the private sector tends to follow slightly afterwards. So in 1958, the civil service, education, so in other words teachers, and the NHS introduced equal pay, but it's not a legal requirement for all workers. So those particular employers, again they're public employers, introduce equal pay, but it's not a legal requirement by this stage, but it's a step in that direction. Again, within the workplace, then it's really by the 70s that the next significant laws or acts are passed. So in the 1970s, 2 significant acts are passed. The first one is the Equal Pay Act of 1970, and so Labour made a commitment in their manifesto in 1959 to actually introduce or outlaw pay discrimination. And so in 1970, the Act is actually passed that finally outlaws pay discrimination. So in 59 we said, or 58, some employers introduce it. By 1970, it's actually now outlawed, and the law comes into effect in 1975. So it's technically, or it's officially illegal to practice pay discrimination between men and women. The next big act then is the Sex Discrimination Act in 1975. Again, it's Labour government. So what they do is they establish an Equal Opportunities Commission to ensure fair employment practices were observed and women were legally protected against discrimination in education and employment. It also sets up tribunals to deal with workplace sexual harassment. And so, it's not, it doesn't necessarily eliminate all discrimination, in particular, of course, in terms of the pay gap. The pay gap kind of does continue afterwards. But what it does do, discrimination in the workplace certainly becomes much more difficult to practice as a result of these acts, even though it does still continue in some form. In particular, the pay gap does remain, but it becomes much more difficult to get away with, and it starts to come down as a result. And so, in terms of economic advancement and workplace opportunities, you could certainly argue that despite some slight limits, on the whole, the situation does improve quite significantly in the post-war period, whereas the political situation, I think arguably you would want to say in an essay that it actually remains quite difficult, both in the interwar and in the post-war period. Okay. So what I'm going to run through now then is the extent to which women's family life changes, or the extent to which they achieve personal freedoms during this century. What I will say is this before I kind of go into it, as I kind of transfer between the political and economic points and the family life and personal freedom points. I think they could either ask this as a specific topic or question. So they could specifically, I think, ask a question about political and economic advancement, or about family life and personal freedoms. They could definitely ask a specific topic or specific question, or they could ask a more general question that combines with the social stuff and the economic and political stuff. So what I would say is, if a question about women comes up, make sure you are aware of what the focus of the question is. The focus is key. So really watch out for it. If it says in the focus of the question, political and economic advancement, or personal freedoms or family life, watch out. If it's something about the role and status of women, then that's a general question. You can talk about anything. Okay? But just do watch out with the language. If it does specifically, for example, ask about family life, then you probably don't want to talk about politics. I don't think it would be accepted. I'm pretty sure that actually, not that I think it would be. So watch out for that focus, and I think either way, there tends to be enough you can talk about anyway, for the most part. Again, as you'll see, the points I'm going to go through for the interwar period, I think, are a bit more varied and slightly more easy to explain than the ones about post-war, which I think are a little more complicated because it relates to like some more conceptually tricky stuff. So I'm going to run through interwar period first. So, what I'm basically going to focus on two things, basically, or rather, three things. Basically family life and also like personal freedom. So, first thing first is divorce. The situation with divorce is a complicated one, so I'm going to try and explain it carefully. The situation with divorce slightly improves during this period. Rather, women's control of divorce or divorce rights improve over the course of this period. So, the context at the beginning of the period, so the key act is this 1937 Matrimonial Causes Act. Prior to this act being passed, women had to prove their partners had been, so if a woman wants a divorce, she has to prove her partner has been unfaithful and guilty of another crime, like domestic violence, incest, etc., if she wants to get a divorce. And so if a woman wanted to get a divorce during this time period, she'd basically have to go through this really farcical process of hiring a private detective to basically gather evidence of her husband or partner being involved in one of these types of things. Whereas for a man, the situation was much more straightforward. So as a result of the 1937 Act, the process makes it basically easier for a woman in the event of unfaithfulness or the man cheating to basically get a divorce. It also allows women to get a divorce if the husband has deserted the home for more than 3 years. She automatically is able to claim a divorce. And so as a result of this act, the number of divorces basically rockets. Pre-1937, it's 4,800 divorces. By 1951, there are 38,000 divorces. So it becomes easier for women to claim or get a divorce as a result of this act in this period. That's the first thing. On the flip side though, although divorce itself becomes easier to obtain, the social stigma surrounding divorce continues to exist, and so that continues to be a barrier for some women in terms of their ability to go ahead with one. So even though legally it's now easier, the social pressures, which are arguably the main barrier in the first place, continue to be quite substantial. So there is quite significant social stigma against divorced women. The best example of this, and it really kind of shows just how much of what the vicious kind of attitude towards it was in public, was the reaction when Edward VIII, the King Edward VIII, has to abdicate, decides to marry an American divorcee, Wallis Simpson. The way she gets portrayed in the popular press, she's basically portrayed as this really wicked gold digger who's sort of stolen the king and seduced him, and she's basically public enemy number one, this American divorcee. So the public reaction to the king's marriage to Wallis Simpson, the American divorcee, illustrates just how much of a stigma there was still towards divorce. So basically, even public opinion itself might have been slightly more approving of divorce itself, even though it's not a very Christian idea. But divorced women basically still bore the brunt of it and were looked down upon quite heavily by those in society. And so although legally it was easy to claim a divorce, social pressures still a barrier for lots of women. The next point, birth control. So birth control, or the attitude towards birth control, or policies towards it, there is some minor change. It's not a huge change, but there is some, well, again, you can say there's progress at this point. And so again, if you consider the context, at the beginning of this period, there is quite strong opposition to the idea of birth control. The government's opposed to it, most sort of like civil organisations, churches, etc., all opposed to it. And so, for example, what you'd get is, you'd get health workers, health workers who would perhaps direct, so if you're a health worker, doctor, etc., if you were seen or found to direct patients to clinics simply asking for advice on birth control, you would get sacked. So health workers would direct people towards birth control advice, would get sacked as a result. Clergymen, so members of the church, were of course also staunchly opposed, and they would kind of view clinics as being quite filthy or unnatural places. And so, beginning of this period in the early 20s as well, there's again very serious stigma attached towards birth control, and there's very strong opposition both from the government and from large members of society, and particularly the religious public. However, the government does slightly change it. It does slightly adopt a more lenient attitude towards birth control. So the government begins to allow clinics to advise mothers. So if a mother's if she's having a second child, so if you've already had a first child, if the second child might physically damage the mother's health, the government allows clinics to basically advise those women to, or rather allows those doctors or allows clinics to basically advise women on issues of birth control if they've already had a first child and the second one might seriously damage their health. It's a really minor change, but it is a change of some kind. So the government does slightly open up on this issue. Additionally, which is a much bigger change, although the Catholic Church continues to remain staunchly opposed to birth control, the Church of England begins to slightly loosen up as well. So the Church of England allows its members to use birth control if they are married. So despite that, the Catholic Church still remains completely opposed to it. So they're able to use things like caps and condoms. Additionally, caps and condoms themselves also become increasingly common, and they're increasingly available to purchase in places like chemists or hygiene stores. So the government itself, we can say, slightly loosens up its attitude towards birth control. The Church of England definitely loosens up slightly its attitude towards birth control. And increasingly, birth control items are becoming easier to find for members of the public. And so there is some change, or some kind of there is some change in that aspect of it, in terms of availability and in terms of availability. Final point about the interwar period, issue of self-expression. This is one which definitely kind of falls down upon class lines. So for a limited number of middle-class women who are kind of able to enjoy the consumerism of the interwar period, you get this kind of embracing of new fashion cultures. Now, when we say middle-class women, it's basically, it links back to the point that we made about jobs. So we talked about how middle-class women were more likely to get clerical roles, because if they were educated, they could get clerical roles. So as a result, if you're one of these limited number of middle-class women who was able to get an education and get kind of these new, more middle-class professions or jobs, you would subsequently have your own money, and therefore they're able to enjoy this newfound consumerism. And so some of these women who have the opportunities begin to embrace this flapper look. So shorter skirts, shorter haircuts, really exotic fashions, the kind of things they kind of get involved in or kind of enjoy, dancing, music, and slightly more unladylike activities like smoking and drinking. These become increasingly common among women who basically have the financial independence and ability to basically spend on these items. But again, it's women who basically manage to get educations and get their own jobs. However, obviously this is clearly a case of there being a divide in the experience of middle and working class women during the interwar period. So this is something which would not have been available to a working class woman in the interwar period, for the reason I just mentioned. They didn't have the same financial opportunities or abilities. Last point about the interwar period, final point, and this is a rather depressing one actually as well, and I think it's one which we've talked about when we looked at living standards, if you remember. So when we looked at living standards, we talked about how the Great Depression disproportionately affected poor women. So again, this is the same thing about class. If you were a working class or poor woman, family life wasn't very easy. The reason being, we talked about how gender roles obviously were still quite strict, and it meant that men were the primary wage earners in a family. If the man's the primary wage earner in the family, women therefore ate less than their husbands and children could eat. The idea was the man as the wage owner has to eat. The children, of course, as they're growing, need to eat, and so the woman would not eat basically, or would not eat properly before everybody else had, and kind of they would sort of bear the brunt of that. So you actually have this 1933 Hungary England inquiry that's published with this report, and it reports that there are many instances of women that are starving to feed their own families. So you've literally got women across the country who are starving just so their families can eat. That situation is made even worse when you consider that large number of poorer families were much more likely to have large families in the first place. I think the numbers they give in the book are like, there are parts of the East End where it was typical to have like 9 children. So if you're poor, you're more likely to actually have more mouths to feed, and therefore the chance of women having to go hungry again increases. So in parts of the country that are affected by the depression quite significantly, like the old industrial heartlands that we talked about beforehand, women increasingly or very often have to go hungry in the interwar period as a result, or rather working class women. So if you're a working class woman, there aren't many opportunities which you receive. And actually, and if we tie this back to the point we mentioned in the first half of this presentation, we said how working class women rarely had any opportunities for like decent jobs because they had no education, etc. They basically had to do like in-service work. To make it even worse, working class women often also went hungry. So you can quite easily make a really big point about how for working class women, and you can combine a couple of points, working class women have very little social advancement, or rather advancement in the interwar period. That's definitely a point you can mention. And you can combine that one with the one that we mentioned in the first half of the presentation. Okay. So, I'm going to briefly go over family life between sort of the end, between the end of the Second World War and the early 50s and early 60s. So, initially, after the Second World War, initially women were actually quite happy to return to their roles as housewives in the post-war period. The war had actually been a time of fragmentation for a lot of women and families. So you've got families being split up due to evacuation, children going to the countryside, you've got husbands being enlisted. So actually, for a lot of women, that fragmentation meant that they were actually quite happy for themselves to resume their roles as homemakers and mothers after the Second World War came to an end. In particular, for a lot of women, again, who were quite happy with those roles, the 50s becomes a much easier time to be a housewife, given the increase or the rise of consumer goods and the availability of modern conveniences that basically purchased by them during this period. So things like washing machines, vacuum cleaners, etc. A lot of families are able to purchase them due to kind of, again, we talked about in previous lectures, this relaxation of consumer credit. And so if you're a working class, if you're a woman that's a homemaker, suddenly jobs and roles which could take you like an entire week can now be done in the space of a few hours. So for a lot of women, that basically is kind of an improvement in their living standards. The flip side of that, though, was this. Actually, the 1950s and 60s is, for a lot of housewives, seen to be, there's kind of this phenomenon of the isolated housewife. A lot of women basically grow very discontent with their situation, with their lifestyle in the 50s and 60s. So, firstly, although the increase in technology and modern conveniences actually gives women more the ability to do things in a much shorter time, and it gives them more free time, there was nothing really to fill it with. A lot of women are basically living in these suburban neighbourhoods who feel very isolated and very lonely, and don't really have many people to sort of associate with, or don't know many people. And so you have this, first of all, this phenomena of kind of the isolated housewife, who's not very satisfied with their situation as a result. The second thing you find is, additionally, you get greater, you've got a situation where a lot of women would have, especially more middle class women, would have given up opportunities that they previously had. So with greater opportunities for education in the post-war period, you increasingly have a greater range of middle class women who've had educations and would have at some point worked in a middle class profession, in an office role, etc. And so for these women, there is increasing dissatisfaction with this very boring, dull life as a housewife. Having again worked in those middle class roles, they often kind of look back at that time kind of longingly with discontent with their current situation. And they struggle to find ways to fill that time. They sort of create these associations, or like these like phone books, I think, for like women who, if they move to a new area, they can like meet people, but it's quite difficult for them to find ways to fill that time. So they grow to become quite discontent with their situation. Yeah, I haven't got much more to add to that point, to be honest. You might want to see if you can find a way to add to that yourself when you do your own revision. So I'm going to basically fast forward then to the women's liberation movement. So really where things start to happen, or the real focus of the post-war period, is on the 50s, the 60s and 70s. And this question of the women's liberation movement and how far, or the extent to which, the women's liberation movement basically has an impact. The women's liberation movement is often referred to as second-wave feminism, so you often see it referred to as that, and that's to distinguish it from what is considered to be first-wave feminism, which was the women's suffrage movement, even though it was never referred to that in a contemporary way. First-wave feminism being the suffrage movement. And so this new women's liberation movement, second-wave feminism, it basically concerned itself with broader issues of equality. So these are things to do with, in particular, really famous ones, reproductive rights, violence, the workplace, and also, generally speaking, objectification of women. So there's this question of, okay, how much of an impact does the women's liberation movement actually have in the first place? So, the first major change, we're going to come back to the idea of birth control, is the question of birth control. So, traditionally, birth control is basically the preserve of men. Even when we talked about it in the interwar period, traditionally birth control is something which a man controls. If you consider the actual methods of contraception themselves, they are basically focused on the man and what he does, for example. It's a man really who controls it, using a condom, etc. This changes completely in 1961 with the introduction of the contraceptive pill. It completely changes the game as women for the first time can actually take charge of their own reproductive abilities due to the way, again, the actual method itself works. And so you have, by the end of the 60s, over 1 million women using the contraceptive pill. So what you find is that women are able to enjoy sexual freedoms, more sexual freedoms without fear of pregnancy. So the numbers are, again, quite stark. If you look, by 1971, half of women had their first child by 25. That number, by the end of the century, gradually falls to a quarter. Okay, so the number of women who are basically getting pregnant at any age falls quite significantly. And as a result, what you're able to do, women are basically able to focus on their education and careers much more. And you have more skilled women entering the workforce. So we talked about how with the marriage bar previously, women kind of, when they do get married and settle down, decide to basically give up their work anyway. As they're able to delay pregnancy more and more, you find that women basically are able to remain in their professions for much longer than they previously could. That process gets made even more easy by the legalization of abortion in 1967. So it worked. So if you're going to mention abortion or pill, put it in the same paragraphs because I think it has the same consequences in many ways. And so the legalization of abortion has the exact same consequence, whether it helps that, as again, women are able to delay pregnancy or childbirth. So you find that by 1979, 150,000 women per year are having abortions, and therefore delay the consequences that come with a pregnancy. Oops. Okay, last couple of words. So, the other main change it makes is, I think what you can definitely, and this wasn't, the women's liberation movement is a very difficult to deal with, because when you're actually talking about it in an exam, how you judge it or quantify it is quite tricky. One of the definite changes it makes, one of the really significant impacts of the women's liberation movement, is the change in perception it creates, in particular over the issue of feminism. So, feminism before the 1970s, or in the early 60s, before that, like, it has a pretty negative perception among people, and particularly, especially among women. It's traditionally seen as irrelevant and not a significant issue. What really demonstrates this is Barbara Castle, who's the most senior female politician in the country in 1968, when she's prompted or kind of asked to discuss the legacy of the female suffrage movement at the Labour Party Congress in 1968, she basically refuses. So even really high-profile, successful, powerful women just don't care about it. It's not something which concerns them. They don't believe it to be an important issue. The legacy of the female suffrage movement is really significant. The legacy of the women's liberation movement is quite significant in terms of how it changes those perceptions. So, for example, you have 1970, the National Women's Conference is organised by a radical feminist magazine, and it attracts a large number of young, middle-class, and educated women to discuss feminist politics. So as a result, you find that after this 1970 conference, the number of women's groups multiply. So in London alone, you go from having 4 women's groups to 50. And so as a result, what you have as an impact, as a result of the female liberation movement, is you have a development of consciousness of feminist issues among a large range of women which you never previously had. And that's a long-term impact and legacy of the women's liberation movement. Women, it's difficult to actually judge. Well, you'll see there are ways in which actual physical success is difficult to sort of measure, but simply in developing consciousness of women is very significant. In terms of that physical success or lack thereof, they are successful in tackling issues of violence towards women. So, women's liberation movement or groups begin to set up, or female activists begin to set up refuges and centres for victims of domestic violence and their children. Additionally, their activism and their action forces the issue to be addressed to the public for the first time. So, Act is passed in 1975, where they successfully campaigned for the Act to be passed against domestic violence. One of the provisions in it is it basically allows women to get banning orders or injunctions against previous spouses who have been shown to have been involved in domestic violence, and if that person is found to have breached that banning order or injunction, they can basically face jail time. So you have, as a result of some of their activities, legislation being passed that helps prevent domestic violence. Additionally, some of the legislation that we talked about in terms of the economic advancement, so the issues, the ones about workplace discrimination, etc., that again can be partially attributed to some of the campaigns that second wave feminists are basically involved in. On the flip side, there are limits to some of their successes. So the best example is their failure to prevent amendments in 1975 to the Abortion Act. In 1975, a MP, I can't remember what his name is, he passes it, or he basically proposes an amendment which gets passed that basically reduces the time limit for an abortion from 28 weeks to 20 weeks. So that gets passed. Women basically tried to organise large demonstrations as a result against further amendments that proposed 4 years later. But again, they're not able to prevent anything. But the opposition to it, again, it comes back to that same point where I think we can definitely say without a doubt, in terms of the success of the women's liberation movement, is definitely the consciousness that it develops among women across the country and across the world. And so even if their political successes aren't the most significant successes, its ability to change people's consciousness certainly is, despite that. And so that, I think, that kind of wraps up the topic.